So radically, so completely different, it's going to be as you compare a Wright brothers airplane to a 747. That's how much your life is going to change because of this. And one of the first things you're going to see is that a person, when your Saturnic part, your traditional part, starts to be touched by Uranus, one of the very first things you're going to start having trouble with are your family. Your parents, for instance. Your family, because they won't understand what you're into. You've opened yourself to something totally new. And it's going to cause a division. There are going to be people in your family that are going to say, what the heck are you into, you know? They're not going to be able to give up tradition. They're not going to be able to give up Saturn. But Uranus is going to come and shake. And some of you that have opened yourself to Uranus, some of you that have opened yourself to the Son of Heaven are going to find that you're having a conflict. Your parents don't become your enemies, but you start moving away from the family traditions. You start moving away from the traditions of your family, see? And I'll tell you something. You'll start all of a sudden to find out that quite amazingly, you begin to confide more in people that are not members of your family than you do of your own family. You'll be able to talk on terms that other people who are not related to you understand, but you can't talk to your own family. I've got in my own family people that if I were talking to this stuff, they'd stare at me. See? I can talk to you. Many of you I can talk very intimately, very closely with, and we can have a relationship, but yet those of my own family, I can't sit and discuss this with. No way. And so those are the things that start to happen. And why is that occurring? Because of that Uranus effect. And this is true. This is happening to you. It doesn't make any difference whether you wish to believe it or you don't wish to believe it. It's happening to you. And it's the most important thing and the most important reason you're understanding this while you're being alive right now is to open yourself to this. Open yourself to it. Don't be afraid of it. But you see, now what you're going to understand, because this is the Son of Heaven. That's what Uranus is called. This is the Son of Heaven. This is the thing that religion has prayed for all of its existence. It's the second coming of Christ. This is the return of Christ consciousness. And this is Jesus Christ who said in Matthew 12:51, suppose I am come to give peace on earth? No! I've come to bring division. And that's exactly what happens to you. There's going to be division between you and your friends. There's going to be division between you and people you work with. There's going to be division between you and your family. People are not going to understand you because this is Christ consciousness that's starting to have its effect, and it's pulling you right out of that which is tradition. Uranus is pulling you out of Saturn. Christ is pulling you out of Satan. That's exactly what it is. You say, we all have a part to play in our existence and our traditions, and that's Saturn. That's your Social Security is Saturn. So that's your traditional ways. That's Saturn. But what happens in Revelation 20, verse 1 to 10, it says, I saw an angel come down from heaven, and that devil that deceived many, Saturn, was cast into the lake of fire. What does it mean it was cast into the lake of fire? It's you! See? It's that part of you that finally finds yourself stifled into your own desires, into your own passions, and your own boredom. You're so blasted bored with life because nothing ever happens. You haven't. Many of us will get to be 30, 40, 50 years and haven't done a thing. You can sit down in this chair, stare at me, and think back into yourself, what have you accomplished? What the heck is the purpose even for the fact that you were born? See? But then you say, well, maybe up to this point, I haven't accomplished, but I've learned that there is a life now, and there is a purpose, and there is a reason, and something's going to happen. Saturn relates to time. Saturn relates to space. It's the need to do things as fast as possible. I got to get this done. I can't. You know, this is what I used to be before Mary and before Kathy, before Andy, before these people were helping. I'd walk into this room. I got to get this done, and I'm picking papers up here and I'm picking papers up there, and I'm closing things and ripping things out. And most of the time, I was forgetting what the heck I was supposed to do anyhow. And then I was saying, wait a minute, I can't do this until I get the other thing. And I'd run into the room to get the other thing. And when I get to the other room, I forget what the other thing was that I was there to get. What am I here for? Then I have to go back, and I go back. Aha, now I remember. And I go get the other thing, and then I couldn't remember when I put my glasses. So I couldn't see what the other thing was anyhow. These things, they're alive. Glasses are alive. They are. These things are alive because when you put them down, they say, ha-ha! See? And they never where you put them. They go away. Okay. But this is Saturn. This is you got to do this. See? And then another part of Saturn is, I've got to do this because they expect me to. You know, it's they again. All of that is Saturn. But here comes Uranus, who since the beginning of the time does one thing. Upsets them and you. Totally gets in between you and them and upsets it. See? The Saturn influence happens to you at the age of 7. At the age of 7 years old, you begin for the first time in your life to realize you are mortal. And when you realize that you are mortal, then at the age of 7, the great stress begins. Because from that point on, you spend your life trying to outwit fate. Huh? That's your whole life. You're going to try to stay alive, to stay unhurt, and to make something of yourself. Right? And here you are. Have you done it? Sure you have. But that's what it is. And that happens to you at the age of 7 because you start understanding your parents. And they've already reached the point of ultimate stress, right? And now you can begin to be like them. You begin to become like your mother, you begin to become like your father. But when you reach the age of 7 and you start getting stressed out, the child then begins to change from mother to father. And the reason is because history. See? What is history? Look at me. Watch. Here's history. That's what history is. That's the root of history. His story. His story. It's all macho, male-dominated. History is his story. Oh, yeah, I know you never thought of it. A lot of things. Said, I never thought of it. That was true. That's what it is. His story. The soldiers come across, and they swarm across the desert, and they win the battle, and so we all become subjected to the male god. But the transfer at the age of 7 from the mother to the father, the reason is because you're going for the authority figure. And the authority figure in your family, the authority figure in my family was my mother. And I clung to her. Because my father was drunk all the time. And when he got drunk, he got mean. I'll tell you, he hated cops. He hated cops. And there was a guy that lived next door to us named Mr. Coakley. I mean, these people are dead. This is years ago. And he didn't like this. Guy was a sergeant in the Newark Police Department. Tough guy. He used to curse all the time. And one time my father really had a load on. He was up. We had a big 2-story house in East Orange, New Jersey. And my mother used to soak these, like, ball fringes for curtains in what did they soak them in? Clorox? Well, my father was up there, and they had windows that opened in those days, And he's looking downstairs, and there's old Sergeant Coakley chopping his hedges. And here was this ball of Clorox, a bowl of Clorox with all his ball fringe. He couldn't resist it. He took that thing and dumped it 2 floors down in that guy's head. And as little as I was, I remember that cop saying, "You could have blinded me, you SO." See? And so I had to, but sometimes he would come home, and he would be so violent that my mother would grab me, and we'd have to run 2 blocks in the pitch black through the streets of Newark, and we found this park, and her and I would run into the park. We would be the only ones in this big park that were pitch black, and we'd hide behind trees, and he'd come in there. It was like The Shining. I'm telling you. I am telling you that. He'd be screaming and looking for us, and I'd be hanging on to her, shaking, and he'd say, "Don't say, be quiet, be quiet." And then he'd leave. We'd get back to the house, and we'd get back there, and if he was still screaming and cutting up, my mother would call the cops, and the Newark police would come. And when the Newark police come in, I was so glad to see the cops, because I was scared that we were going to die. And when the Newark police would come, they'd say, "Well, where is he?" Here he comes down. He's got his bathrobe on. "How are you, officers? What's the trouble, officers?" Would you like a cup of coffee? I'm telling you, I didn't know where I was coming or going from. And he'd get on his Brooks Brothers suit the next morning, go to work. He was a big interior decorator for Macy's department store up in New York. And nobody could believe what went on in that house. But, I mean, we used to have brawls that made the OK gunfight at the OK Corral look like a Red Riding Hood. I had 2 brothers and a sister, and they used to have fist fights. And I've seen people get knocked over the banister, just like in a cowboy movie. I've seen my mother chase him up the stairs with a knife that long. No, I'm serious. Thank God that she didn't catch him. But those things, I was only this big. And of course, I told you the story. The man wound up, when I walked in at 14 years old, I walked into the house, and he was hanging in the doorway. He committed suicide. Okay. Brilliant man, brilliant interior decorator, one of the greatest that... But see, it forced me at that time to look for an authority figure that I could cling to, so I hung on to my mother. So my mother became the authority figure, and she could handle it. She could handle it. And I survived because of her. I survived because of her. And so my authority figure then became my mother. And see, here then, when you have Uranus that comes upon you, and you're trying, or Saturn is trying to hold on to you, see, what happens then? And these are the things that you begin to feel. You begin to feel that your spirit, you're not functioning, you're not progressing anywhere. You're not getting anywhere in your life, see? And this is a Saturn phenomenon when you start to feel like that, and the Saturn phenomenon is called depression. Depression. Depression is a Saturn phenomenon. That's why you can easily line Saturn and Satan. Saturn and Satan in the Bible are the same person. It's an effect. It's a vibrational effect that we open ourselves to. It comes into a universal effect that affects the lower mind. And what we have to do is lift. That's why meditation is so important. You lift yourself to a higher frequency of consciousness, to Uranus, to that which is the God of heaven. That's why crystals are so important that you carry with you. So that you are open to that light, that you have something with you that can take in that light. Okay? So then when you have this depression situation going on because of Saturn, and all of us have experienced depression. There's nobody in this room, there's nobody out there on television that hasn't at one time or another experienced depression. But what is depression? Depression is actually reflection. Okay? Depression is actually reflection. And what are we reflecting on when we are so-called depressed? It is that something in our life, okay, that is preventing our growth or our happiness. That's what depression is. Depression is simply a way of the spirit saying to you, this is what it is that is keeping you from accomplishing. This is what it is that is keeping you from having life. This is what it is that has to be changed. And so you dwell on it, and dwell on it, and dwell on it. So that's why meditation is so important, because when you meditate, you raise yourself up into that higher realm of consciousness. Come on, stay with me. You raise yourself up into that higher realm of consciousness, and there you receive answers. There you receive light. There you receive understanding. And there then you can deal with that problem. There you can deal with the situation that you have. Meditation is so important because the depression is not really there to hurt you. The depression is pointing out to you what it is that is inhibiting your growth. I'm telling you, before the fine people in this place started to help me, I was actually starting to experience this because I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't get this. I didn't know what to do. And it had an effect between my relationship at home with John. So I had to, I was depressed, but it was constantly, I'm thinking about it. And it was just nature's way, it's God's way of saying, this is what you got to do something about. So it's not bad. If depression becomes manic and so forth, it can become a very serious situation that needs a doctor's care. Sure it can. But I mean, that which we call the normal time of our reflection, or we go into a depression, is just nature, or God, if you want to say it that way, speaking inside of you and saying, think about this. This is what it is that's holding you down. And you say, oh, I'm so depressed. What are you thinking about? There is something there inside of you that's making you feel bad, and you're thinking about it. And that's what has to be changed, and that's what can be changed as we move up over Saturn, up into the sky, into Uranus. Okay? There is a Saturn Capricorn type. Okay? There is a Saturn Capricorn type. And what this is, and how they... is the reality of the status quo, the terrible thing that is inhibiting you, the traditional thing that's got you held down, and then Capricorn comes, which is the action that leads you to growth based on what needs to be changed. Suddenly, for instance, that interaction between Saturn and Capricorn says, I am held down by the tradition, but there is Capricorn which comes along and says, this is what should be done in order to change the direction you're going in and changing the problems that you have in your life. And Uranus makes it happen. Uranus makes it happen. Capricorn will give you the direction to lift yourself out of this morass, out of this depression, and then Uranus makes it happen, plugging into that heart. That's what Christ is, you see. See, that's what Jesus tried to get through you. It's in you. All of the electrons, all of the electromagnetic fields are in you, waiting to be touched by these vibrations. If you'll exercise that which Jesus called the single eye, open yourself to it, you'll start to be touched by these vibrations, by this light which activates in your electromagnetic system of your brain, and you'll start then to plug in, and you'll be able to get out of this and raise yourself up into this. And then through Capricorn, you take on new action that fulfills your life and changes things. Now, what induces the depression? Uranus. God induces the depression. Because the mind all of a sudden starts to become filled with the directions of God that says, you are being inhibited in your life by this. Do something about it. This is what's wrong inside of you that should be changed. And if you will allow this to be changed, you'll be lifted up and you'll have a new life. It's simply God or nature's way of saying what's wrong inside of you. Because Uranus is always in a struggle with Saturn, and Saturn is the status quo. Saturn is the tradition. Saturn is, I was born this way and I'll stay this way. Say, this is what I am. This is, my mother was this, my father was this, my grandmother, and I'm going to stay this. That's the tradition. But all the time, Uranus is slamming on the door saying, hey, change it, change it, change it, change it, change your traditions. See? And what's happening here is, like it says in Matthew 11:12, Jesus says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence. What's that mean? From the days of John the Baptist until now. It was the time of John the Baptist when the Western mind realized the need to move from the earth, which is the lower mind, into the water, which is the Jordan River, which is the second stage of consciousness or truth, to be sunk and submitted into that water, and then rise up into the air, which is the third stage of consciousness, which is the third heaven. Say, we didn't know that. See, the Western mind didn't know that before that. There was none of this in Judaism. There was none of this in the Old Testament of Judaism. This comes out of Buddhism. It comes through the Nazarenes and then the Essenes, and it came out of John the Baptist. You've got to move out of the earth, which is your lower mind. You've got to come into the water, which is the second stage of consciousness. And when you submit yourself to the second stage of consciousness, you'll rise up into the air, which is the third stage of consciousness. That's what baptism is all about. It has nothing to do with being sunk in water. Nothing at all. Nothing, not real water. It's getting away from the earth, which is your lower mind, getting into the water, which is your second stage of consciousness, and then rising up into the air, which is the third. That's why it says in the Bible you will rise to meet Jesus in the air, because you rise into the third stage of consciousness. The third stage of consciousness is the third heaven. That's why the Apostle Paul said, I had an out-of-body experience and was taken up into the third heaven. That's why it says in 1 Kings 6:8 that when they built the temple, they put the door to the holy place on the right side, which you entered with winding stairs, which is Kundalini, which took you to the right side and then up into the third. All of this means there's a third stage of consciousness in your head. And when you get there, you rise into the place where God dwells. But what he said is, from the time of John the Baptist, you see, from the time of that preaching, of that understanding, the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdom, what is the kingdom of heaven? You! The mind. The human mind is the kingdom of heaven. That's why Jesus Christ said, the kingdom of heaven is in you. It's in you. Say, let me show you something. Since I've been getting this help, I've all of a sudden relaxed a little bit, and I was studying. And I'm doing this in a few weeks on Sunday morning, but I'll just give you a little bit. So, here is Jesus talking to the Pharisees. And he turns around and he says, hey, you bunch of two-bit hypocrites. You know what you do? This is what you guys do. You guys say, okay, swear by the gold in the temple. You know, the gold in the temple is important, but you say, forget the building, forget the temple itself. See? And I said, what the heck are you talking about? This is Jesus who said the buildings don't make any difference. I said, what the heck are you talking about? What is the gold in the temple is not as important as the temple? And as I'm meditating on it, flowed by me. What's Jesus Christ saying? See, when you look at the construction of the temple, the whole thing inside is covered with gold, and gold means God. So what are the Pharisees saying? The Pharisees are saying it is God that's important. What do the religious people say? It's God that's important. It's Jesus that's important. It's the Holy Spirit that's important. But Jesus Christ spins around and says, forget it, Buster, because if there is no temple, if there is no you, there is no God. See? Huh? If there is no you, there is no God. And if you don't make a place here in this temple, there is no God. Doesn't exist. If you cease to exist, God ceases to exist. Instantly. Just like that. Gone. Nothing. Doesn't exist. Because God cannot exist without people. What's he going to do? Who's he going to bless? See? But the point being here that Jesus Christ is saying God is not near as important as you are, because if you don't exist, neither does he. See, what Jesus is saying, that you are so important, there can be no God unless there's an Al. Can't be. Because if you don't exist, he's gone. You could take everyone in this room, and say, you're all gone, you all disappear, there's no God. Only when you are alive, only when you are viable, only when you are the temple can a God exist. So Jesus said, don't tell me about God being the important thing. You're the important thing, because his whole existence depends on you. Is that something? Huh? That really is. And when you look at it being totally contrary to everything that Jesus taught about the building, there's not one rock going to stand on top of the other building. He's talking about the physical building. But when he talks about this temple that's not built with human hands, he's turning around and saying, hey, I'll tell you something. If those buildings don't exist, there is no God. That's how important it is. That's how important it is. Yeah, you can get along for a while without God. But you know what? He can't get along for a second without you. He can't exist without you. So the mind becomes conditioned by the cultures and the traditions, and the mind is forced under threat to think as it is told. That's why Jesus Christ says they try to take it by force. How do they try to take it by force? Because they scare the pants off of you, first of all, in telling you, you've got to do it their way. You've got to do it their way, or you're not going to get anywhere near God. See? That's Saturn. That's conscious. Carl Jung said about just beyond our conscious awareness is our subconscious. It is called the higher mind. It is just beyond Saturn. And Saturn tries to suppress the higher mind because Saturn is only concerned with the existing reality of your life. That's why the psalmist said in Psalm 61, you don't have to go there. You can if you want, but what's the difference? I'm just about done here, but I wanted to share this with you. Psalm 61. And it says, okay? Psalm 61, verse 1. Hear my God, O God, attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto you. When my heart is overwhelmed. And what does he say? Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And if you want to bring it down to 1991 scientific God stuff, bring me to the place of the pineal gland of the brain. And change it from sand to stone. And let that be the stone that the builders rejected. But I will take it. And it will be the capstone of my building. It will be the single eye. And from there will pour forth light into me, out from me, which is the Christ. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Because you and I are of the lower, and the rock of the pineal of that which is of the higher. Lead me to that place. And then it says in verse 3, for you have been a shelter for me, a strong tower from the enemy. In other words, that's meditation. The shelter is when you hide yourself in the ark within. The strong tower is when you lift yourself to that place above all of your enemies. I will abide in your tabernacle forever, which is within yourself. I will trust in the covert of your wings, which is that of the mighty spirit dove which surrounds you. Selah, Selah, Selah. Peace, peace, peace above.